Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's ASEN event. I'm delighted to be joined by Knott, Associate Professor in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics. I think I met you, Ellie, when I was doing my masters and you were doing your PhD. So we've known each other for a little while now. We're here to talk about Dr. Knott's Ellie Knott's new book, Kin Majorities. Um, in Moldova, the number of dual citizens has risen exponentially in the last decades. So now over a million, over a third of Moldova's population, have become Romanian citizens. Before annexation, many saw Russia as granting citizenship to, or passportizing, large numbers in Crimea. Why do communities engage with citizenship from an external state, and how does engagement with dual citizenship intersect or not with identity? So that's what we're looking at today, um, with with Ellie's book, which is published this year, in fact, just recently by McGill University Press, with data collected from ordinary people in Crimea and Moldova just before Russia's annexation of Crimea, to explore the intersections of identity and citizenships in these cases. Um, Ellie, welcome. It is super to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, David, and thank you for ASEN as well for hosting this event.
No, we're delighted to. Um, we're delighted that we can do this and we can promote the book. Without necessarily wanting to be too political with regard to Ukraine, I should draw everyone's attention to the statement that ASEN made regarding the situation in Ukraine, and of course, our particular concern for academics there, but also for everybody who's been affected by the war from Russia. Um, but we'll start, as we always do, with our traditional questions, if I may. Who is your favourite scholar on nationalism?
So you primed me to tell me that you'd be asking this question. So I was thinking, and I'm gonna give you a two-part answer that requires me not to make a choice. So I think that the single individual that like kind of summing their work together, I'm like really leading up to the answer. If I think about their work as a whole, the person that I've probably taken biggest inspiration from is Rogers Brubaker, like from his kind of earlier work on citizenship and nationhood in France and Germany, nationalism reframed, kind of bringing in this kin state approach, and the kin state nexus is a huge part of this book. To ethnicity without groups, kind of questioning what ethnicity and what identity are in the first place, and how we may or may not study them through groups, and thinking about other ways to study ethnicity and identity, to the book on Transylvania and kind of an everyday approach to nationalism with John Fox, Margaret Fleischmidt, and Eleanor and yeah, just kind of accumulating that work together has been a big inspiration for my work. And so the second part of the answer then is kind of where the book on Transylvania leads into, which is the everyday nationalism approach. So that's not a favorite scholar, but I think that the everyday nationalism approach was really kind of at least revolutionary for me in a different way to think about how we study nationalism, from not just questions of like what is the nation and when is the nation, to actually how do everyday people engage with the nation, and how do we understand what it means for them to engage with the nation, to negotiate identity, to give meaning to identity, to practice kind of something with regard to the nation. So within that kind of everyday nationalism realm, from John Fox's work, I'm forgetting people now, David Stroop, Paul Good, Michael Skay, Marco Antonsik, like together, like that kind of everyday nationalism thing has been a really big boost to the kind of stuff that I have looked at in this book, and kind of more generally in my research.
No, I don't claim to be on the same level as you, but I understand completely where you're coming from. I've said my field work for my thesis wasn't quite as glamorous as the Crimea and Moldova. I went to Barking in East London, and I'll just say it's a very long way from a university library. And yeah, yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I think we've started to get onto this, but where did the idea from the book come from, and what literature are you responding to in your book?
So the idea for the book, I mean, it builds on what you were just saying about this kind of drive throughout, well before the PhD, of being in the field, and just the sheer joy and enjoyment, frustration at times, like difficulties, struggles at times, but just what it means to engage with people around issues. And so before my PhD, I'd done some work in Moldova, and I think from the very beginning, like, I just think Moldova as a society and state has been fascinating. And because it's like this kind of somewhere between plural, in the sense that there's different languages, different cultures, different people living side by side, quite a lot of contestation about what Moldova is, whether it's a nation, whether the Moldovan language exists or doesn't exist. And in that kind of mix of plurality and contestation, at least from the top down, was this kind of bizarre normalization of just the rapidly expanding numbers of people that were regaining Romanian citizenship. Like, as you started talking about, kind of 1 million people in the last 20 years. And just a kind of almost total acceptance of gaining Romanian citizenship. Like, that wasn't a part of contestation, and that really intrigued me. Like, why is this so normalized? Why is it like something that politicians do, judges do, teachers do, everyone is basically doing? What is their motivation? What is the meaning of Romanian citizenship in Moldova, and in particular, how is it kind of playing into people's understandings about what Romania is, what the Moldovan state is, what they believe its competencies to be? So kind of in the midst of trying to look at all of those questions, I was learning Russian, reading about Crimea, and it seemed like basically Crimea could be another case of that, like the kind of proliferation of Russian citizenship. And that's kind of what I took to the field, like this idea that Crimea was super pro-Russian, and like, that what I had observed in Moldova of big popularity of Romanian citizenship would be the case of Russian citizenship in Crimea. So I go to Crimea, I've read all this stuff, this is what I'm thinking, and I really struggle to find, I did not find anyone, and I continued not to find anyone that had Russian citizenship. And I talk more in the book about how and why Russian citizenship was not available, not desirable, not accessible, not legitimate. But it was such that like contrast, and I entirely had to kind of shift the project, because it became a question actually of a kind of surprising presence and surprising absence. Because I think a lot of people think that Crimea is super pro-Russian, and obviously events since 2014 have kind of reinforced that idea. And then the book is very much about saying, I think we need to kind of revisit how complex identity is in Crimea, and how complex identity is in Moldova, and how that can play out in different ways in terms of what Romanian citizenship means in Moldova and what Russian citizenship means in Crimea. Because there was so much kind of individual contestation, intergenerational contestation when it came to identity and citizenship in both cases. And I talk a bit about how they converge and diverge, that people identified often in very different ways to their parents. And that in both cases, there was much more of a kind of civic understanding of identity than I had anticipated, kind of political, a desire to talk more about the identity with the state than identity with the nation, and particularly in kind of a kin state nation as well. And kind of different things going on with regards to citizenship. So trying to explore why Romanian citizenship was so legitimate in Moldova, and why it wasn't just that Russian citizenship was inaccessible, it was also that it was considered illegal as it was, but also like people didn't want it. Most people didn't want it. I talk a bit about who wanted it in Crimea, but most people did not want Russian citizenship in Crimea because it didn't give them what they wanted, and it didn't give them what they needed. They didn't really want to move to Russia. Crimea is sunny, but not just that, like they saw Ukraine as their legitimate state. So I kind of tried to explore how and why I think these cases are doing slightly different things when it comes to the kin state, and also kind of challenging our own assumptions about why we might expect Russian citizenship to be more popular in Crimea than I found it to be, and also why we might. So Romanian citizenship in Moldova is often associated with the EU, that everyone just wants it for material reasons. And I say, yeah, sure, that's a part of it. But there's also this kind of idea of legitimacy and normalcy that goes beyond that kind of strategic material value of Romanian citizenship. Sorry, that's a really long-winded answer for
No, not at all.
where the
No, it's
idea for the
fascinating.
book came from. But the literature, so obviously,
I was going to say, if I'm going to ask open questions,
yeah, you get an open answer. So the literature that the book is engaging with is so kind of firstly in the kin state literature, like there's been a huge amount of really important work on what kin states do, what policies are available, but it has tended to be from a kind of state orientation, like what states are doing, what policies are making available, and how antagonism might arise between a kin state and a home state. But there hadn't really been much from the bottom up, which is again where that everyday nationalism perspective comes in, to say, well, what does a kin state mean to people who are claimed as co-ethnic by a kin state? And again, kin state literature had very much focused on kin minorities, and I think that's for a very understandable reason, that minorities are often more discriminated, more at risk. But in both Crimea and Moldova, the cases of the book, but also I would say we could think of other cases. I mean, even Taiwan, you could think of as a Kin majority, where or Republika Srpska, where a majority of a state or sub-state is claimed as co-ethnic by an external kin state. How does that look different when it's a majority being claimed as co-ethnic rather than a minority, when that majority is not at risk of discrimination so much by their home state because they have local institutions and policies and laws that give them more rights than, say, ethnic Russians in Estonia and Latvia, where we know that, you know, there's been policies of kind of alien passports. Like that is not the case in Moldova and Crimea. People are not discriminated against because they are part of the majority. And so trying to also look at what it means to engage with a kin state when you're not a minority, but rather you're kind of part of that claimed co-ethnic majority.
and I think that leads on neatly to the third question that I warned you about in advance. Just before we go on to that, I will say we're live on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll relay them to Ellie as we go. But the question then, the big one, what's the argument of your book?
So yeah, I was thinking about this, and I feel like I should be able to distill it at this point, but instead I was kind of thinking about it in different ways, like theoretically, methodologically, and empirically. So theoretically, I think it's about, I shouldn't think, right? I wrote it, I should know what it is. It's about the need to study different conceptual units of kin state politics, and to do so from the bottom up. That's the kind of thrust, but that's not really the finding. The finding is more that actually kin majorities themselves, and this seems slightly contradictory when you actually look from within, which is the whole point of the book, it's like, what does it mean to be a kin majority from the bottom up, are actually much more complex, contested, contingent, uncertain, that actually identity is plural, citizenship practices are plural, and that actually that majority is very kind of complex in terms of meanings and practices when we look from within. And so we shouldn't just assume cohesive sets of preferences within Moldova towards Romania and within Crimea towards Russia, and that plays out in different ways in which identity and citizenship intersect. And for some people to be Romanian in Moldova is to be like to be Moldovan in Romanian, to be Moldovan in Moldova is to be Romanian, but there is no difference. Those are kind of biological, organic relationships where by virtue of blood, you just are Romanian if you're Moldovan. But not everyone thinks like that. And that kind of leads to different interactions with Romania and with Moldova. And similarly, not everyone in Crimea identifies as both ethnically Russian and also is discriminated. That was a particular political articulation. So how do I distill that into something kind of analytical and meaningful? I think another kind of big inspiration for the book, although at the time that I started out, I was kind of doing this, what felt like more on my own, was combining both kind of immersive, interpretive, bottom-up methods within a cross-case comparison, because I think the joy of comparison is really that it becomes more than the sum of its parts. Like if this book had just been about Moldova, or if this book had just been about Crimea, there would have been a lot of stuff that I had lost in terms of that learning and dialogue between the cases. So I might not have realized that intergenerational contestation of meaning, so you identifying in a different way to your parents, identifying in a more civic and political way with your state versus the way in which you might see your parents as more ethnic, was something in common across the cases. And kind of identifying that commonality made me think more about how is it that people are being socialized into societies that make this intergenerational contestation play out. And equally, that kind of juxtaposition when it comes to citizenship, that it's not just about the prevalence of citizenship or the lack of prevalence of citizenship, but kind of how and why these two cases kind of contrast in that dimension. And then empirically, it kind of springs on everything that I've said before, that when you look from the bottom up, I didn't have to think in terms of census categories or mutually exclusive categories of whether someone is Moldovan or is Romanian or is Russian or is Ukrainian. Rather, it's about how those categories are negotiated and given meaning and understood. And for a lot of people, it was also about the hybridity and duality and uncertainty of those categories. So, for example, there were a lot of people that identified, there were a number of people in Crimea that identified as Crimean. That wouldn't come up in a census. And we wouldn't necessarily understood what it meant if it did, but it meant the idea that Crimea is politically, territorially, historically situated in between Ukraine and Russia, and people themselves often had both Ukrainian and Russian parents, and so this Crimean identity was a way to kind of bridge that duality, and it was a kind of regional hybrid that allowed them to articulate that plurality for themselves. And so exploring identity kind of beyond mutually exclusive categories, and I started out talking about Brubaker's ethnicity without groups, is something that I really tried to explore in the book. And similarly then apply that approach to think about how citizenship isn't mutually exclusive. By becoming a Romanian citizen, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how you feel about Moldova. It might, but it might not. And how do we look at how those kind of plural practices are negotiated and understood, and that it's not necessarily that identity is predicating citizenship or citizenship is predicating identity, but this is kind of messy, contingent, bidirectional relationship in which identity and citizenship are intersecting, and that differs between and across the cases that I look at.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that comes out in the book when you're setting out the method. I think you describe it as a messy comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think you can see that obviously, the sort of classic methodology things, you're looking for these quite neat distinctions, and it's this or it's that. But obviously, where you're dealing with where clearly you can't impose those categories from above, because people are more complicated that, and particularly in these situations. And so you do have to take this rather different approach so that you don't. I don't know. I was going to say that you don't lose detail, but actually so that you don't impose detail that isn't actually there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the contextual comparison, so I think it's both about keeping contextual detail, but it's also coming from a very different position, that if you think about Mill's methods, it's very outcome oriented. So we can think about outcomes or we can think about variables, but it's trying to explain, why does this thing happen in this case
Yep.
and happen in this very different case? Or why does this thing happen in this case but not happen in this very different case? There's very similar case. But I'm not trying to explain outcomes. I'm not trying to explain why individuals do certain things, but how they understand, negotiate, experience the world in which they live in. And to look at what are the ways, when we put Crimea and Moldova in dialogue, that we see similarities and differences. Where are there convergences, say with regards to identity, and divergences, say with regard to citizenship? And what does that say about how identity and citizenship intersect? And then that's kind of where the messiness comes out, because there's no singular uniform answer. It's like, it looks a bit like this and it looks a bit like this, and like that it's trying to kind of tap into and explore that complexity kind of how that plays out and what it means, and trying to study the state essentially and kin states through that kind of, like, what do we learn about what Romania is doing in Moldova when we explore it from the bottom up? And something that I kind of comment on in the book is that it's really interesting when we look at that Romanian citizenship isn't undermining the Moldovan state, but it is providing some level of like security or insurance for, like, if the Moldovan state were to fail, people would have an option. And similarly with regards to Romanian scholarships, that they provide this option, but they're also to some extent undermining the Moldovan state because they're taking students out of Moldova. And they're also saying, well, actually, maybe Moldova doesn't have to provide as many public goods for its citizens because there's this kind of dependency on Romania because Romania can do it. And so it's kind of complex. And how does that fuse with how we think about identity and citizenship and how they play out? And then what do they tell us about the state as well?
Mm. Let's pick you up on that, just so everyone's sort of on the same place. What exactly is a kin majority? And to an extent, I know it does what it says on the tin, but you talked a bit about you know, in terms of how it differs from a kin minority, in that they're not minoritized, they're less likely to be subject to the predations of the state or discriminated against and so on. But how else does being in a kin majority sort of impact people differently to being in a kin minority?
So one thing that I think has been really interesting about writing and researching and working on this is how unconvinced people still are by the concept of kin majority, which makes me think, like, my job isn't over. Like, I still have something in me that wants to keep working on this. So the book isn't, and this is where, you know, authors are always really annoying, because I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, not the question I was answered. But the book isn't a comparison between kin majorities and kin minorities. And I think that could be really interesting, is to look at how does a kin state differ when it engages with a local majority and when it engages with a local minority. So that is very much out there as a kind of future thing to potentially be explored. But it's rather about saying kin state literature has done really amazing things, but it's either only focused on minorities, which, again, important, as we talked about, they're at risk of discrimination, being minoritized, etc. Their rights are more limited. And generally the case is that minorities are at risk of discrimination in ways that majorities aren't. Or, so it's either only focused on minorities, or it's assumed that by virtue of being a kin state community, you are a minority. So it's really interesting when you look at people talking about kin minorities in Moldova or kin minorities in Crimea, and you're like, but they're not local minorities, they are claimed as majorities. Romania consider the majority population of Moldova to be ethnically Romanian. Now, that's not what the Moldovan census says, but that is what Romania believes, that there is no difference between being Moldovan and being Romanian. They claim the majority of the population that live in Moldova to be ethnically Romanian.
Right.
Similarly, Romania considers itself not just a kin state to to people that live in Moldova, but kind of to the state as a whole. And so sees this kind of role as both kind of leveraging Moldova's interest within the EU, but also when it comes to COVID, when it comes to the iodine tablets that were recently distributed, Romania is kind of playing that role again as a kin state to a whole state by providing those resources, providing those public goods. And I think that looks very different to, say, how Hungary interacts with Hungarian minorities in Romania, or Russia interacts with Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia, where they are minority communities, where there isn't as much political power, political representation, laws and institutions to kind of protect and buffer that minority, which is, again, not to say that all kin minorities are necessarily at risk of discrimination or are being discriminated, but it has left apart this whole kind of conceptual ground around kin majorities. Similarly, Crimea is a controversial kin majority, or has been perceived as a controversial kin majority, because it's a sub-state, not a state. and being like, how can you compare a sub-state and a state? And I'm like, well, if you look from below, the claims look very similar, that people on the ground are claimed as co-ethnic, are claimed to be co-ethnic within a local majority by an external state. Again, in the Crimean census, 58% of people in 2001 identified as Russian. So they are a local majority. There was very strong, to some extent, sense of being a majority within Crimea, that there was a parliament, there was protections around Russian language and Russian culture, which didn't exist in the rest of Ukraine. Again, I don't want to get into like, I think there's been a lot of supposition that ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine have been discriminated, and that is not what the book is suggesting. In fact, the book is suggesting that they weren't, but that it means, what it means to be Russian in Crimea within that majority space is quite different to what it means to be ethnically Russian or a Russian speaker in other areas of Ukraine, because of that local political institutions, not necessarily at all the success of local Russian pro-Russian political parties, but that it looks and feels different when there's that kind of majority space.
Right, but also this thing that people also, there's a sense of Crimeanness. You know, obviously the Crimean Tatars, but the sort of non-Tatar groups still have, you know, that feeling of Crimeanness, even if it is overlaid with other things as well. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is about people who describe themselves as Russian not necessarily identifying with Russia. Which now I'm and forgive me if I'm way off base here. I know there's in Russian, I believe there are two words that are both translated into English as Russian, one meaning ethnically Russian and one meaning citizen of the state of Russia. Is it that sort of thing, that there are people who feel ethnically Russian but don't feel that affiliation to the state, or is that I mean, or as you said in the book, it's something rather more, you know, is not one thing, but people relate to it in different ways.
Yeah, so there's Ruski, ethnic Russian, and Rossiyski, which is like more kind of Russian system, because Russia itself is multi-ethnic, right? Like you can be a Russian citizen without being ethnically Russian, although increasingly difficult. But so it's kind of about that, but it's also about, I guess, a more theoretical point, which, because we haven't explored, I mean, again, it's not like I'm necessarily the first person to look at kin state politics from below, but we haven't so much necessarily challenged this idea that co-ethnic identification and kin state identification are not the same thing. It's totally possible to be ethnically Russian in Crimea or ethnically Romanian in Crimea, in Moldova, and not to identify and not want to engage with Russia in Crimea or Romania in Moldova. That there are local ways of identifying co-ethnically that have nothing to do with the kin state, right? It's almost, and it's almost to say that you can speak English in the US without having zero to do with the UK, right? Russia does not own the Russian language. Romania does not own the Romanian language. And that's kind of also kind of engaging with diaspora studies as well, right? Like it is possible to have nothing to do with that state that claims you as co-ethnic. And I don't think, particularly in Crimea, that people have thought about that enough, that why do we assume that being ethnically Russian in Crimea is a political statement about your affiliation to any state? Now, there were people who identified as ethnically Russian and strongly with Russia. I talk about them as being politicized Russians. Many participants referred to them as professional Russians because they were the only people that were engaging in pro-Russian organizations, and a very small minority of people that I interview in the book. They were politicized, they were in those networks, those networks were that kind of active participants in annexation, hence the kind of politicization of them and my desire to frame them as very politicized. But there are a whole bunch of other people that I talk about as being ethnic Russians in the book, or political Ukrainians or Crimeans, who either had some part of them or more fully wanted to identify as ethnically Russian, that wanted little to nothing to do with the Russian state. Often would also criticize, and there are some quotes in the book about this, like criticize their ethnically Russian relatives that lived in Russia who were both Ruski and Rossiyski. So again, it's not even like being ethnically Russian means that you're similar to your relatives who are ethnically Russian but living in Russia. Like, we shouldn't necessarily kind of assume those two to be the same. And also people that were super critical of the Putin regime. And we shouldn't assume that identifying as ethnically Russian is a political statement towards a state or a regime. And I don't really understand where that illusion has come from. It doesn't say anything about territorial preferences. It doesn't say anything about political preferences. It doesn't say anything about regime preferences. It is possible to have a local understanding and articulation of an ethnicity that happens to be transnational.
Yeah, I mean, you've actually, I know this is not at all a majority, but there's a paper I read, and I can't remember the author's name now, which isn't very good, about the development of the Armenian community in the United States, which began as a group of Armenian expatriates or exiles, but became, and they were talking about the shift of Armenian newspapers from the Armenian language to the English language in the US, that people were still identifying as Armenian, but the relationship with Armenia changed quite dramatically, and actually in quite a short period of time. This was a period of 20 years. Can I suggest on the latter question about, and I know this is going off topic a bit, but that why people are assuming Russian speakers or how you choose to define it would support Russia, is that we tend to have the categories of state and nation and civic and ethnic nationalism and the rest that we have are firstly too simple, but also always dichotomous, and that people are always looking for for very simple, you're either this or you're that. Do you think that might explain that, why like in general discourse in the media and so on, there is this assumption? I mean, I know we're talking particularly here about Crimea, but the assumption I think was also made in terms of the eastern portion of Ukraine as well.
And I would say similar in Moldova, that we necessarily think that to identify as ethnically Romanian in Moldova should come with some kind of predictions about people's territorial preferences. So since the 90s, there have been debates and discussions and movements, often relatively small scale, for reunification of Moldova and Romania. But identifying as ethnically Romanian in Moldova says absolutely nothing about your political interest, understanding, desire for, again, it says nothing about territorial preferences, right? You can be ethnically Romanian in Moldova without wanting reunification, but we've kind of assumed that there's a causal arrow going from identity to politics without questioning that arrow. And so you talk about kind of the media supposition, but I think this is also academic. I think that people really haven't unpacked it. And I think that there is this kind of simplistic understanding and kind of dichotomized understanding. And I think surveys can often play into that, of like allowing people only to be one or the other, ethnically Russian or ethnically Ukrainian, or ethnically Romanian or ethnically Moldovan, without allowing people to negotiate and tell you what those categories mean for them.
Right.
But also almost doing a kin state's work for them by suggesting that if you have a certain understanding of your own ethnicity, that you're kind of a fifth column in waiting. And I don't say this explicitly in the book, but I guess it's kind of about that, of saying like, yeah, don't make that assumption, don't make that illusion, because because the state wants, the Kin state wants you to believe that everyone is Russian and pro-Russian in Crimea, and that annexation was just a fait accompli and people's natural kind of desires and preferences finally coming true. I think people question the legitimacy of the referendum without questioning the outcome. And the book is trying to say, why do you think you know the outcome of what a free and fair referendum looks like when we haven't even really scratched the surface on what the complexities of identity and engagement with Russia before annexation in the 21st century? Because a lot happened in the last 30 years. And I think in some respects, we're still kind of stuck in what is a kind of Soviet, early post-Soviet understanding of how. So to go back to your question in terms of both the kind of simplistic dichotomous understanding, but also a lack of temporal perspective, that things are changing, they're dynamic, they're contingent. And that's why I talk so much in the book about intergenerational contestation, because you can see how people are doing different things to their parents, wanting different things to their parents, and identifying in different ways to their parents, partly because of the dynamic nature of politics and partly due to growing up in different educational systems. But people's understanding of themselves, their state, their society is shifting over time. And I think we're still kind of stuck in, again, kind of a state-based narrative. Like, I think we're often as political scientists, too quick to follow what the state wants us to think, rather than critiquing why the state wants us to think that.
Right. Absolutely. On that, I'm going to go to a question from chat, and do put your questions in chat if you have any. From Chedin Schengel. My apologies if I've mispronounced your name. How does being Moldova differ from being Romanian in terms of feeling of identity? Is it just a case of belonging to a Moldovan state or to a Romanian state?
So in the book, and again, this is in a way a snapshot of how identity was being understood and given meaning at a particular moment in time. Like, I wouldn't say that someone would do interviews in Moldova and would necessarily find the same categories. But the point is that I'm not talking about individuals. I'm kind of looking at how people coalesce into these different groups. And I look at kind of 5 different ways of understanding identity in Moldova. And here I'm talking about on the kind of Moldovan Romanian spectrum. I'm not looking at ethnic Russians, I'm not looking at ethnic Ukrainians or Gagauz. So firstly, there's like organic Romanians that see the Moldovan nation as artificial and a Soviet artificial project, where there is basically no difference to them between being Romanian and being Moldovan. It's quite a primordial understanding of identity. Like, we have the same ancestors, we are the same people. So that's the kind of organic articulation. Then there's the like kind of cultural Romanian perspective, where there's like, it's kind of a partial overlap, where there's a recognition of some commonalities, but there's also a strong articulation that to be Romanian in Moldova and to be Romanian in Romania are also very different experiences. Like, Moldova was in the Soviet Union, Romania wasn't. Romania was under communism and under Ceausescu, but there was no Soviet system. And so what it means to be Romanian in Moldova, there are some customs and traditions in common, but there are also different. Like, Moldova is plural in a different way to Romania is plural. And so that interfuses with their understanding about what it means to be Romanian in Moldova. Then there are ambivalent Moldovans, Romanians, who are just like, I don't like, it's just so complicated and I don't want to have to make my mind up. And there's this kind of hybridity and ambiguity, and in a way we need to stop talking about ethnicity and instead start talking about things that really matter in people's lives, like poverty and socioeconomic deprivation. And then there are Moldovans who have a political understanding of what it means. So to be Moldovan is not anything, it's not a statement of a nation existing, it's not necessarily cultural, it's speaking Romanian and identifying with the state of Moldova. And then the final category is very, very small, and it's like linguistic Moldovans, and it aligns quite heavily with kind of leftist politics in Moldova, Soviet, neo-Soviet kind of parties, where there isn't just a nation of Moldova, there's a language of Moldova, there's very little connection with Romania, and they really pathologize Romania as a kind of neo-imperial colonizer of Moldova. Like, Romania is a threat to Moldova and a threat to Moldovan nation, a threat to the Moldovan language. Ideally, Moldovan should be written in Cyrillic. It should be seen as having nothing to do with Romania. So how does being Moldovan differ to being Romanian? It depends, but also we shouldn't see that as an answer with a question with a singular answer, right? The whole point is plurality and contestation and understanding how identity can be given meaning in different ways. And we can look for those kind of convergences, but we should also investigate the divergences, because we shouldn't expect coherence. We should kind of expect that negotiated, contested complexity, and then look at how Romania functions similarly or differently as a kin state, depending on how you identify. It's kind of what the book is doing.
And on the one that I find, I mean, it's always, but that third category of people who are, who don't care, I'm going to sum it up like that, or who have got bigger fish to fry. Is that generally seen as being, I mean, I'm interested to know how many of those people there are, if that's a sort of popular position. But is that generally seen as being, people are happy for people to not take a position, or deliberately not take a position? I'm afraid you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's right.
I don't think it's about not caring. I think they really do care, because I think so that this kind of hybrid, either this hybrid category or this desire not to talk about ethnicity, also existed in Crimea. And again, there it wasn't about not caring either. Like, people really, really care. It's just they're a bit exhausted, so, as if politics is only about identity and only about cleavages related to identity, ethnicity, and language. And it's rather about saying, can we stop talking about this? This really doesn't matter. Okay. We don't have to reconcile this question. We have to actually look at corruption and look at poverty and fix those things, rather than obsessing about questions of identity, which don't need to be reconciled, right? We can just be uncertain and ambiguous, and it's okay. So I think it's more about, it's not like a nonchalance, like, I can't be bothered to answer the question. It's about saying, why does that question matter in the first place?
Right.
Which is why I also tried to kind of say, this book it's about challenging assumptions, but in a way I tried to take you through my assumptions as well. Like, if you think about the way that post-Soviet politics has been written in the past 30 years, or even the fact that we call it post-Soviet, there's a lot, a huge bulk has been written on nationalism and questions of identity, because these are some of the biggest cleavages in politics, but they're not some of the biggest cleavages in society. Moldova's a particular instance of where, less so now, but up to a time, Moldovan parties were very, like, you could segment Moldovan parties depending on how they position themselves with regards to identity. So identity looked like it was politicized, but it wasn't really reflecting cleavages in society. It was just an easy way to get out of having to talk about some of the bigger questions around corruption, clientelism, poverty. And so, yeah, sorry, that was a long-winded way to say it's not that people don't care, it's just they don't think it should be given the kind of standing that it has been.
Yeah, no, and that there are more bread and butter issues that need to be get on with, and no, absolutely, no, I completely get that. One of the things you talk about in the book is citizenship as an act. And so you have the act of acquiring citizenship, and I get that. Does acquiring citizenship from a kin state, are there ways that the citizenship it can still be an act after the acquisition of citizenship, or does that close that avenue?
So I'm going to answer that question in a slightly different way. So kind of stepping back and where does citizenship as an act literature come from, which is in a similar way to where everyday nationalism comes from in relation to nationalism, which is that, again, super useful literature, but the bulk of citizenship literature, at least kind of empirically, has focused on the more kind of policy top-down state, like what do states do in terms of regulating and allowing and facilitating citizenship acquisition for migrants and for external co-ethnic kin. Citizenship as an act is more of a sociological bottom-up idea that you can be a citizen, but it doesn't mean you have equal rights. Mm-hmm. So you can be Roma in Romania or Roma in the UK before Brexit. It doesn't mean you have equal rights. And so how, and it kind of sees citizenship also through the lens of struggle and through the lens of what citizenship means for people, or what the absence of those rights mean for people with citizenship. My approach kind of tries to integrate or kind of sandwich those two together, because what I find really bizarre about the citizenship as a act literature is it actually doesn't focus on acquisition. It focuses on saying people with citizenship don't have equal rights, which is amazing and really important, but it doesn't look at why people might want citizenship or what they do with it or how they acquire it, etc. So that's why I say, like, we also need to look at citizenship practices, of which that aligns with citizenship as an act, but it's also about what the practice of acquisition looks like. So is citizenship still a practice, I guess, is your question, after acquisition?
Yes.
Yeah, totally, because whether you're voting, and you can think about that particularly with regards to say Romanian elections in Moldova, like what do you choose to do with your citizenship after you have acquired it? Do you choose to vote? How do you use it if and when you cross borders? So do you use your Romanian passport to go abroad? How do you use your Romanian passport to go abroad? So citizenship continues to have meaning and to be used kind of before, during, and after the process of acquisition. And I look a little bit at the kind of after, and have written a paper on kind of citizenship as a duty and looking at voting practices of those who have acquired Romanian citizenship or reacquired Romanian citizenship. But yeah, for sure, it's that whole kind of life cycle of citizenship that can be studied as a practice. And equally, like, in a way that pertains to migrants as well, to people that naturalize to citizenship, in a sense that citizenship provides rights. And so one of the interesting questions is, how do people use those rights? When do they choose to use those rights? How is citizenship kind of constructed as a duality of receiving rights and feeling a duty as a consequence of those rights, or again, with regards to naturalization, not necessarily having complete rights as a consequence of gaining citizenship. And we kind of saw during the Trump administration that naturalized citizens could also be unequal. So how do they kind of imagine and experience and practice what it means to be a citizen in a state that isn't necessarily accepting you as equal, or would see a naturalized citizen as someone who can also be stripped of citizenship?
I was going to ask a question about about Moldova and the sort of instrumental thing of getting EU citizenship through Romania, but I think there's a better question that's come from chat from Dejan Stjepanovic. What role do supranational identities like Soviet or EU play in the constellations of nationalism and citizenship in the two cases?
What role does supranational
identities,
Soviet or EU,
play in the constellations of nationalism and citizenship in the two cases? If any.
It's a really good question. Thank you, Dan. And also hi. I think that it's easier to answer that question with regards to Moldova, because like I don't think that Romanian citizenship can easily be distilled into people just want it because of access to the EU. It's also this kind of certain amount of like gaining rights and gaining dignity. It's people talk about it's kind of Europeanization of the self or Europeanization of Moldova from within. So there's clearly a nesting or an alignment of those two things, that Romanian citizenship is a gateway to the EU, but it's not just the kind of material value, it's also that symbolic value, that kind of that level of humanization and dignity and equalization of rights. But it's not the only dimension of why Romanian citizenship is important in Moldova. It's also about getting back rights that were taken away by the Soviet Union. And so that, I guess, speaks to the kind of Soviet angle of Moldova as well, which is that people's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents lost Romanian citizenship due to kind of the consequences of the Second World War and the annexation of Moldova away from Greater Romania into the Soviet Union by the Soviet Union. And so that's why I keep saying not acquisition, reacquisition, because Romania views Romanian citizenship for those who lost citizenship and their descendants as reacquisition, as getting back those lost rights. So in a way, it's both the EU angle and that kind of Europeanization of the South, and then what Europeanization of the South means in terms of getting back a status 50 years, 60 years later that your grandparents lost, and almost the idea that you would have that status if not for the injustices of the past. Mm-hmm. And I think the EU, that kind of angle of Europeanization of the South, functions to also it interplays with territorial preferences, because at the moment that I study these questions, I think Romanian kind of reunification with Romania is not really seen either as politically practical or desirable. And in a sense, we're in a kind of new political moment right now, but thinking slightly before 2022 and slightly before Russia's war in Ukraine. And I'm not saying that that is predicating things one way or another. I just think it creates this kind of new uncertainties, and in a way it's easier to think a little bit before that. But Europeanization of Moldova from above or from within is very much seen as like a way to circumvent all these questions. Like, if Moldova is in the EU, it doesn't matter anymore. And why do we need to be campaigning or not campaigning for reunification with Romania when we can kind of function as Romanian citizens? So we don't have different rights anymore. And those territorial questions don't matter. What matters is this bigger issue of geopolitical kind of reconfiguration and modernization of Moldova and pivoting towards the EU, rather than only having this kind of bi-directional relationship with Romania. So I think there's a lot of kind of infusing with how the EU is understood in Moldova and how Romania is kind of channeled to the EU, but also that it's a kind of answer to those bigger questions and a way to kind of circumvent some of the problems as well. But that doesn't mean that Europeanization for Moldova is easy, and in a way, the Western Balkan experience is Moldova has never been nearer to the EU than it is today, but that's largely as a consequence of Russia's war and occupation of Ukraine. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's very near when we look at, say, countries like Albania that have been in candidate status for decades. And so I think there are really big questions to come of what Europeanization of Moldova actually looks like, both within Moldova and also within the EU. And that's really not what this book is about, but I just kind of wanted to comment on that. I have some other thoughts as well, but I'll leave those for another question.
Well, I've got another question from Nico Takna. Citizenship is often associated with rights, but what did people in Romania and Moldova think about duties associated with citizenship? I think here especially of potential military service and conscription in case of war in both of your cases.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say that this book is about, if you can imagine back to a peaceful time before Russia annexed Crimea. It's about that time. And so that's why even talking about the book in 2022 is like with, we're now in an even more uncertain period. So military conscription, or the idea that these, I was going to use the word political reconfigurations, that's not a good way to explain what Russia has done in the last 8 years, annexation, occupation, invasion. But military conscription was not seen as a reality. It's not to say that people didn't think that these kinds of things were possible. It's just they didn't necessarily think about their rights in relation to them to an extent.
Just because it wasn't salient.
I mean, it's hard to say it wasn't salient, because it did come up time and again, this idea of, so we don't think it's necessarily likely, but you just never know. And it speaks more to kind of a distrust in the future and stability and security, that Romanian citizenship was still kind of functioning as an insurance policy, like just in case, like it's better just to have it just in case. And again, not to say that they anticipated anything conflictual or with regards to Russia, but it was just kind of this, you just never know, right? Like our grandparents lived through things. It's more of a reflection on the uncertainty of the past than it is necessarily totally a reflection on the future. But even in that space of like seeing Romanian citizenship in Moldova as an insurance policy, I don't think people really thought about it in terms of what they might have to do as a consequence. Now, it's not totally clear that there are duties of military conscription with regards to Romanian citizens in Moldova. So that is not really kind of a way to answer the question. But I do think like that there is a really interesting aspect of duty that comes to voting. And we know that Romanian citizens in Moldova have been decisive, particularly during Basescu, like decisive kind of voters, because Romania has external constituencies and Moldova has a very large amount of voters within one of its external constituencies, and so has senators and a senator and a deputy that represent those external constituencies, of which Moldova is a fundamental unit. So I do think that in elections, the number of people participating was kind of going up in the sense of like giving back. But I don't think that giving back just pertains to voting as a duty. I think it was also about wanting to talk about the legitimacy of Romanian citizenship. This kind of assumption of materiality, that people only want Romanian citizenship to leave Moldova, only want Romanian citizenship to get a job in the EU, and kind of saying like it's also our duty not just to let that be why people think we want Romanian citizenship. It is also about regaining rights that your grandparents lost, about a kind of Romanian citizenship as a reparation for those historical injustices of the past. So kind of correcting that idea of what Romanian citizenship also means, and that it isn't just this kind of material value as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I think those ideas are really, that's kind of why future research needs to be done on kind of what the consequences are with this kind of ongoing uncertainties.
So actually on that, we're coming up on an hour, so we'll be wrapping up fairly soon. But I'm going to go to, where do you think this approach could be expanded beyond Moldova and Crimea? And I'm going to be really mean and say Northern Ireland ?
Yeah, it's really I do try to think about what Northern Ireland is in that kind of space, and it just kind of blows my brain for its own level of complexity, my own sense of like profound and unreasonable ignorance as to regard to like how that would play out. I do think Northern Ireland would be interesting to kind of to look at that, but then in Northern Ireland, we're not really talking about acquisition of citizenship, but more the plurality of citizenship. And again, that could be super interesting. And looking in particular at not necessarily divided perspectives, but kind of negotiated hybrid perspectives. But yeah, I think in those cases, and Mate Subasic looks at this in kind of Croatian communities in Bosnia, like in those kind of trans-border ethnic community spaces, especially if you have local majorities or potentially ethnic enclaves, where you have those kind of local majorities, or where you have citizenship acquisition expanding, or where you have kin states really facilitating citizenship en masse. But also, I would say looking at kind of contra expectation cases as well. Like, I did not expect Crimea to not be a case of Russian passportization, and that's why I kind of keep writing about this point, because we just kind of take for granted that Russian citizenship was really popular in Crimea before annexation, rather than look at how Russian citizenship has essentially been imposed and Ukrainian citizenship stripped of people residing in Crimea since 2014. That's the human rights disaster. Not only the situation of Crimean Tatars in Crimea is a bigger kind of human rights crisis, but Russia, you know, it's easier on Russia if we just accept a lot of people wanted Russian citizenship before or had Russian citizenship before, because it allows Russia to get away with what it has done as a consequence of annexation. Right. And so we shouldn't take for granted that those things happened before, because in fact, if they happened after, the consequences are more serious, and we should kind of take those seriously. And similarly, in terms of how Russia has facilitated, somewhere between imposed and facilitated citizenship, first in Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and then in the Oblast of Donetsk and Luhansk, and then the entirety of Ukraine, Moldova. And so this is a kind of shifting landscape, and kind of continuing to follow and critique what the state is doing versus what the state wants us to see.
Yeah,
I think is super important.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, actually, I think that's actually really quite a good note to end on, because I know I've been guilty of this as well. But actually, there's, you know, we do need to think about what, when we use categories, obviously they have importance and they mean things, but it's where are those categories coming from? I think it's the point you make very well throughout the book. Any final thoughts?
I mean, I would say, you know, doing that work is difficult. It takes a lot of time. It takes, you know, a journey of self-discovery. It's frustrating, but it's also really rewarding. And I think I wouldn't suggest people work in Crimea, but I do think that there is way more stuff that can be done from the bottom up in a way that can seem challenging, but that those kind of hurdles are not insurmountable. And they can really provide fascinating and rich and very enjoyable along the way insights, as much as that kind of journey of self-discovery can have moments of existential crisis.
I think that's standard for any sort of PhD or research, long-term research project, isn't it? Mine was. On that, our next event is going to be on the 25th of October at 4 o'clock UK time. We're going to be talking about Luca Manucci's new book, The Populism Interviews, where Luca has been interviewing various people who write on populism. And we have Luca, we also have Daphne Halikiopoulos and Aurelian Mondon, who contributed to the book as well. So do look out for that, 25th of October at 1600 UK time. Don't forget the call for papers for our conference, which is coming up next year on nationalism and multiculturalism at the University of Loughborough, is out. You can find all of the info for that on our website at asen.ac.uk /conference, or there's a big thing on the front for the conference. Thank you all very much for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think all that's left to Ellie, I should say, where can people get the book?
From your local independent bookshop. You can get it from the behemoth that is Amazon. I think it's currently sold out in the UK. I put a discount code up on Zoom. If anyone wants the discount code or details for order, just let me know. If anyone has any difficulties, the book is quite expensive. If anyone has any difficulties getting or locating or wanting the book, again, you can just email me and I will do what I can.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And
Thank you,
hope to
David.
see, oh, no, thank you. Hope to see lots of you on the 25th. Good evening.